Hi, I'm Mike Fleming.
And I am Barb Chose.
And this is the Finding Healthy Church podcast. This is a podcast where we're exploring together what it means to be a church, but not just what it means to be a church that's actually thriving, not just surviving. We talk about being healthy because we want to check vital signs. We want to diagnose ailments. We want to prescribe remedies, all those metaphors of being in good health, I guess. And the reason is because we know a body only really expresses its life to its fullest potential when it's healthy, right? If you're injured, if you're sick, you can't do what you're made to do at the level that you're made to do it. So we want to provide whatever help we can to make sure that can happen wherever we can.
Mm-hmm. And also the kind of work it takes to do that, because it does take work.
Ah, yes. Barb being the spoiler. Yes, it does take work. We've learned some things so far. We're in the midst of our first series of conversations. This is episode 5 that we're on now, and we're in this series of conversations about the nature and purpose of the church, and we've identified some things. We've learned some things about church health in this series so far. So I want to point out a few things just to kind of set us up for what we're going to talk about in this episode. We've learned that church health starts really with a healthy perspective of God's nature and purpose. Mm-hmm. It's seeing his nature really as an eternal community of love. God's not an individual. He's an eternal community of love. And then it's seeing his purpose of expanding that divine community, expanding that community to another, that being the church. We kind of know Eve was a woman in the beginning, a perfect woman, but she was just a picture of something to come, and that was the bride of Christ. God's an eternal community of love. He wanted to expand that to another, his bride. And we also learn that church health starts with not only seeing those things, but also what are the implications of those truths.
Right.
We learn it's unhealthy, really, to start your understanding of the nature and purpose of the church from anything other than that. Right. You got to start with the nature and purpose of God first, and then go from there, work your way down to the more practical things in life. Because fundamentally speaking, the Christian life is about keeping God as our source. God is the source of everything. That's what we believe. And so we want to keep that in all that we do.
Yeah. And it also, remember in the scriptures in Genesis, God says, let us make man in our image. The creation of man is to be his image. And so, yeah, there is that is important for us to remember. He didn't just create human beings just for the heck of it. There was almost a genetic DNA that is in us because of how he created us, that we were created in his image.
Right. Yeah. We've learned that God didn't, from God's perspective, he didn't create an individual human and then another individual human, and then those two had another individual human.
Right.
He created a whole race in one body.
Right.
For all the New Testament readers out there, that should sound familiar. He created many in one body. And then he split that body in two and purposed it to become one so that it could then multiply. And then through multiplication, expand the community, which should be one, right? So This many in one pattern we find throughout the whole scriptures. Yep. Many in one, all the way to the end when God becomes all in all.
Yep.
That's really a picture or a foundation in what it means to be a healthy church. Is how do we mirror that? How do we image that? Like you said, Barb. Mm-hmm. When you see God's purpose and God's nature in this way, it's really unhealthy to make I the center of everything. It's really healthy to make us the center of everything. Mm-hmm. Whatever communities you are a part of, whether it be your marriage, your family, your church, and on and on and on, in those communities, it's making us the center of everything. And we talked about it being unhealthy in our culture today. What we find is an unhealthy balance towards a focus on the individual Christian, an individual Christian's life and growth. Mm-hmm. But it's healthy to gear everything towards God's eternal purpose, which is having a communal image on the earth. And so a lot of our ministries and our churches are all built on programs and that try to get you to become a better Christian individually, right? How to be a better prayer warrior, how to, get closer to God, how to have a better prayer life, et cetera, et cetera. But truth be told, the problem with that is if you're not in a community that's working towards God's eternal purpose of being the communal image, you're not in the right habitat for that growth to happen. So when it comes to life, whether it be plants or animals or anything, we know that if you take them out of their habitat and they don't get the environment they need, the things that they need to thrive. Mm-hmm. You take sun away from a plant, you take a polar bear and move them down to the equator, it's either going to die or it's going to lose a lot of its functioning.
Right.
It's going to lose some kind of functioning. It's not going to be able to function the way that it was made to, and it's not going to thrive. Right.
Exactly.
What we want to bring to light is this issue of it's good to focus on individual Christian growth, but it's unhealthy to have an imbalance towards that, where now it's just all about the individual.
Yeah, it's understanding that we have to decide. I mean, obviously, we need the individual learning of what it means to live in the image of God, but there's a purpose in that, and the purpose for that is not just that I would become a better person or would be, if I'm going to be in the image of God, then I will also be doing that for the sake of others. In other words, it's not just for my own salvation. It might be for the salvation of someone else, or it might be for the salvation of a group of people. In other words, if you take the human body, if my heart is not working properly, it will affect my lungs. It'll affect my joints. It'll affect just my life, my whole body. But what happens sometimes with that is if the lungs are working well, they can help my heart become better or cover it or help the healing process if it's doing its job of working with me and in me and partnering with the rest of my body. So I think that's one of the things, if you can get an image of a human body and all the functions of the systems and the organs, that individually all those systems are good, but they all depend on the other systems for me to have a healthy body. So I think that's a good image for us to understand, I think, what it means to be in the body of Christ and why it is important.
Yeah, and so we find that when there's an imbalanced focus on the individual, our growth is stunted, right? Mm-hmm. So the average maturity level of a person in a church nowadays, at least where I live, maybe where we live in our country, and we're sitting in America, both of us, that the maturity levels are stunted, So a lot of our churches are just filled with, if we related it to, physical maturity, there's like a bunch of toddlers and adolescents running around, and I say that, and honestly, I don't say that from a podium, speaking down to people. I say that as someone who relates to that. The way I feel is man, I would be so much more advanced if I had mature Christians around me, or at least, Christians pursuing the Lord together in a close-knit community. I'd be a lot farther, right, in my own journey as well. So I think I had my first child a couple of years ago, and so I'm in the throes of toddler life, and that has definitely exposed things in me. I'm just a toddler too.
Yeah.
I mean, an adolescent at best. Let's be honest. And so, yeah. So the point being, right, if we don't establish a habitat in which we were made to grow, which is a community, a close-knit community of Christ followers, if that's not the habitat that we're in, and we're just trying to individually grow through programs and, mental studies and those types of things, we can expect that our growth's going to be stunted, because that's not the habitat in which growth really occurs to begin with.
Right.
And you might survive, but like I said at the beginning, you're not going to thrive as an individual or as a church.
Right. I mean, it could be that you really don't, and I think we all fall short, so we don't live up to the idea or the dream that the Lord had for you when you were created. Mm-hmm. So, or when we were all created. I think that's part of it, He created us to be his partners, and I think he longs for us to do that. And we do. We fall short. We do well in some situations, and others we don't. And sometimes we do well because we're in partnership with other people. Because there are many things that I think come at us that if we had partners, we would do much better at achieving, I think, the Lord's purpose than trying to do it all ourselves.
Yeah. And so, okay, yeah, we've established that we need this habitat. We need it. It's essential to healthy church life. So in this episode, we're going to talk more about that habitat and specifically talk about pictures in the scriptures of this many in oneness that we've been talking about. So we've looked at it in the creation of man. We've looked at it in God's own nature as an eternal community, 3 in 1. But there's some more pictures, and we're going to take a look at those and focus in on one in particular that give us insight into the nature and purpose of the church. There's a popular prayer by Jesus in John 17. I'm going to read just a little part of that. It says, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you sent me. And of course, Jesus is praying for his followers here, right? He said, I pray that they would be one with each other, with me, just as the persons in God are one. And what we find here and through the rest of the scriptures as well is that oneness is really determined by location. So in this prayer, you can see he uses the word in many times. And inness, if that's even a word, inness, being in, whether it be in the case of God, they're co-inherent, or it's a fancy word for just saying in each other, or whether it be other pictures like a marriage, right? Or a family, you're in the same house, a community, you're in the same location, you're in the same town, city, a nation, you're in the same nation, a world, you're on the same planet, so it grows or gets out there. But in all these cases, like what determines, an entity is the location. Right. We mentioned this before in a previous episode, but oneness is not just agreeing on things, right? Just agreeing is not unity, because just to give an example, like I could want something or try to make a decision. If my wife comes to me and says that's okay, yeah, we can do that. We agreed on it, but she could have something in her heart that wasn't quite right with that, or she could feel contempt for me even wanting to do that thing, and maybe there was fear there, and so she didn't say anything. And there's a lot of different reasons why we might not be unified, even though we agree on something. Right? So just to make it clear, like agreeing on things is not what we're talking about. It's a level of relationship where there's a closeness or an inness that determines oneness, not just agreeing on things.
Right. You can have unity in the midst of diversity. Our human bodies are all different, but there is unity. And when there is unity in the midst of all the organs and systems working together, your body is complete. It's, there is a singularity about that gets formed, a unity that is good and right, and that makes you healthy, And I think that's one of the things that people struggle with. It's that, no, we all have to, there are some foundational things that you obviously have to agree on and build on that unity, but that doesn't negate the fact that there's also diversity, and important to have that. Yeah.
So inness determines oneness. And what we find throughout scripture is that God has always built things to dwell in. So look in the Old Testament, the ark, right? His presence was in the ark, the tabernacle, in the tabernacle, the temple, in the temple. All of those were just pictures of mankind, who was supposed to be the reality of what God was to dwell in. Of course, made a bad choice, and God had to then enact his plan to make that right. But the point is, he built mankind to dwell in. But here's the thing. We must be built together in a very practical way for God to dwell in us as a community. For the oneness of God to be expressed, we have to be built together. And Peter actually talked about this in First Peter when he said, "You also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house."
Mm-hmm.
And so we have this picture here of like, we're stones, but we're living stones because they have life in us. But even those stones need to be built together to be a house, or else they're just a pile of stones.
Right.
Right. So, Barb, I think it was a couple episodes ago, you had brought up how you had a relationship with a member of your church.
Mm-hmm.
And at first, it was maybe a little rocky, or you guys never like thought you would be really close, right?
Right.
But it seemed like over time, what you were getting at was that you became built together, and your relationship changed with that person. You became built together, and you started becoming more one. So I thought, hey, can you share a little bit more about that and how that happened and what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, I would say, we obviously didn't know each other. We had not been together when she first came to be a part of our congregation. And then we ended up being in a prayer group with women. A group of women from our congregation would pray every morning. And then as time went on, some of the other gals either had time constraints and job constraints and stuff. And it ended up that we were the only two left. And instead of saying, well, it's just two of us, so, we just continued to do that. We just continued to pray. And in that time, we got to know each other, even in the midst of our personality differences and things like that. But we got to a place where things became more intimate than just social and friendly, that kind of like that casual friendliness that you see people and then you never talk to them. We would pray, but then we'd see each other because of how physically close we lived to one another as well. And it ended up that my sorrows became her sorrows and her joys became my joys, and we discovered our burdens were lighter because we shared them, and we were able to take care of each other during that time and also celebrate the wonderful things that happened. But, we went through a tough time at a period of our life, and she was just with us. She went with us in the midst of the struggle, just to be there and to be with us. And to have that kind of intimate partnership just made our burdens lighter. And I think when Jesus says, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest," he's not going to take the burdens away. But I think what he meant in that is the way he wanted to create the oneness is that when you share those things, they become lighter. And then when you have joy, they become greater because the celebration, how is it when you have something to select? Say you get a raise, or say you get a gift that you longed for, and you have nobody to tell that to celebrate that with. I think when you stop and look at celebration only becomes wonderful when you've got somebody to share it with. And so I think that is one of the things with joy. I believe the definition of joy is that you're neck deep in what is good and right and true. And so when you don't have someone or someones to share that with, I think the level of joy gets diminished. But when you have people who know you and are alongside you, and whatever the situation is, it just becomes so much more wonderful in one sense, So then what ended up happening is then our partnership, as we became more intimate in our relationship with each other, we were able to include others and bring them in and say, and just purpose to share what we had with others. And so it's just a shared life. It's just so we both feel like that is how God intended, and we would have never, if it had not happened in the way that it happened, we would both be very diminished.
Yeah. I think one of the keys here in your story is like when you first met each other, there was some sort of hump you had to get over, right? It was like, I think most people, when they meet people or they, connect with people in their church, like generally speaking, we kind of gravitate towards those we're compatible with, right? Those that have the same interests as us, those that have personalities we like. Yeah, just generally that we're compatible with, right? So you guys were kind of put into a situation without planning it, where it was like, oh, we have a choice here of like continuing to dig into being built together with someone maybe I'm not naturally compatible with, at least that's not what you all thought at the beginning, right?
Right. She especially did not think she would be my friend. I mean, she didn't,
right.
She had an image of me or thought of me in a certain way, sort of assumed some things.
Yeah.
And I think as we grew, she realized that I was a certain way that was, in one sense, I wouldn't say lovely, but it was not fake. It's the best way I could put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so those are the things, you said those are the humps that you have to kind of get through and have your mind changed.
Yeah. And so like if that hump wouldn't have been gotten over, like if you wouldn't have had a mindset, like, what matters is not that we are compatible, right? What matters is that we are sisters in the Lord. This incompatibility is a perfect opportunity to learn what it means to love each other, right? At a deeper level and be built together despite like incompatibilities.
Yeah. And there is also a level of humility, I would say, when you're really depending on one another. She was in a situation where she was had some financial needs. And so my husband and I went to her and say, hey, we want to help meet those needs and help you through this hump. Just like family would. Those are the things that draw you, those kind of intimate needs in some ways are the things that kind of draw you together to build the kinds of relationships that I think make you one with others.
Yeah, so there's a really good picture of oneness in the scriptures, and most Christians know it very well. It's when Jesus said, "On this rock I will build my church," when he was having a conversation with Peter, and he asked him, "Hey, Peter, who do you say that I am?" And Peter's like, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." That moment was really when it hit Peter that God was an eternal community, because he wasn't just identifying Jesus as the Messiah. When you look at the phrase, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," he's saying the term Christ is actually the term for anointed one by the Holy Spirit. And then a son shares the same life as the Father. And so like what Peter's getting at is like, oh, you're God. Like, okay, like I didn't know that yet. And now I know. That's who you are. And Jesus then says, "On this rock I will build my church." When you look at the original language, the Greek, Christ calls him Peter. And that word in the Greek is Petros, and it literally means a stone. So a small stone like that you would pick up and throw. And then when Jesus said, "Upon this rock I will build my church," the word he uses there is Petra. So Petros for Peter, Petra for rock. Petra is also a great 80s band. I don't know if you ever listened to them. But
No.
That was my first ever concert, actually. That
Really?
my mom ever took me to. Yeah. I was allowed to stay up past my bedtime. By the way, they are still playing concerts.
Really? Wow.
Yes.
Look at.
I just saw something on Facebook. Somebody went to their concert. And of course, they look very old because they are very old. But
Sure. Hey.
but they're still playing. They're still out there playing.
I know it is kind of crazy. Some of these groups from, for me, it was back in the 70s. So it's like they're still playing and you want to go,
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally. Yeah. I took my in-laws to see Chicago recently. And it was like the original. Most of them are original, but band members of Chicago.
That's great.
Watching them try to dance was funny. That was, I got to admit. But hey, they could still sing and play their instruments. So
That's incredible.
anyways, back to my point. The word for rock, when Jesus said upon this rock, is Petra. And that word actually means a large rock or a bedrock. So you have Petros for Peter, meaning a stone.
Mm-hmm.
And you have Petra for the rock that the church would be built on. The stone is a piece of detached rock, essentially, is what a stone is, right?
Mm-hmm.
The rock, Petra, is a massive rock, like a bedrock or a peak or a mountain. And so basically, right, the picture we're getting here is Jesus is saying, hey, I am the mountain that you've been cut from. And we know in the rest of the New Testament, it talks about like a part of Christ is inside of you since the foundation of the world.
Mm-hmm.
You've had a piece of him, reserved for you, basically. And so we have this picture now of the mountain, which is the Lord, and then us being cut from him, but then with the purpose of those stones being built together into a house in which he lives by Spirit. Here's the point. Until we're built together, we're just a pile of stones.
Yes.
All of this like individual effort that we're putting together, again, individual pursuit of the Lord is not a bad thing. Yeah, it's not wrong. But until we're built together, we're just a pile of stones.
Yeah, it's not complete.
It's not complete. Yeah. And the thing about it, going back to your story, is that those stones need to be built together, meaning they need to fit into one another. You don't want cracks in the wall, you don't want holes in the wall. And that takes some chipping and filing, right, away at our edges where you have to chip them, file them, and that happens as a natural process as we rub together, so to speak.
Yep.
And they have to fit together, right? And that whole thing is a process.
Yep.
And in your story, you had the environment, the habitat in which that process could take place. You lived close to each other. You spent time together. You met like every morning. You were in each other's lives. You were carrying each other's burdens. You were, all these things, all these one another's that we're encouraged to do and that should be natural to us as Christians. You were set up with the opportunity for that to happen. And that resulted in the chipping and the filing that allowed you to be, fitted together.
Yep, that is true. And it can be, obviously, when you're in an environment like that, it can be, how would I put it, revealing. You get to be known, which I think a lot of times we have a fear of being known. And yet God is saying, I want to know you, and I do know you. And I would want others who live in my name to also know you so that they can come alongside you and carry your burdens or celebrate your joys or any of those things. Yeah. And so it's how do we create that kind of environment? And I do think there is a lot of dying to self that in a good way. I mean, like it's not like being a, stomped on, like a rug or a carpet, where you just kind of let everybody know. It's being able to say there's a purpose for being known because I want to be all that I can be for the Lord. And so I need help.
Yeah. One of the main points then is it's all about being built together. And to be a healthy church, that's what it takes. And we get this misconception, I see it, that we just need new teachings. We need new doctrines. We need new traditions. We need a different church model. We need a different church structure. We need a different agenda. There's all these its, right? There's all these its out there, but no one seems to ask or focus on how are we built together.
Right. Well, and we forget that Jesus gave us an idea of that. I think, it begins by living into his words. In John 13, he's having a conversation with God and he's saying, well, they will know he's telling his disciples, they will know that you are my disciples. You're my people. You're my family by the love you have for one another. That's what's going to set you apart. And so what you have is he's talking to at least, 11 disciples, plus maybe some women, and maybe there are other followers there. But he's basically saying they're going to know who you are. They're going to know that you are mine by the love you have for one another.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things why I think the church is not having, there is some comment out in the world right now that, people are leaving churches, people are leaving the faith, people are leaving. And I think some of that there's a foundation of this that's not being lived out. And that's why people are walking away. And why the church doesn't have the impact that it should have, maybe because they aren't seeing. What they're seeing is the internal fights and disagreements. And it's not to say we can't have those, but it's to see how we work those out. So I think that it's that important.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a situation where we're just a pile of living stones.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a pile of living stones, you're not going to have impact.
Mm-hmm. And so on a local level, it has to be demonstrated. And that's, we'll reserve that for future conversations. I can at least share some of what I've been about for the last 45, 50 years and, flesh that out a little bit.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's a great point to wrap up. I think so. Next episode, we're going to talk about the question, how can a group of people be built together? If that's what needs to happen, if it's not about model structures, doctrines, etc. By the way, we're not saying you need to have sound doctrine. We're not saying that.
Right.
Of course. But if the end point of all that, if the end point of all the doctrine and everything else is being built together, how does that happen? How can a group of people be built together? That's what we're going to talk about next time.
Right.
We'll see you then.
Why did you ask yourself that question? Why do you try but coming up with these inventions? Do you know why did you ask yourself that question? Why do you try but coming up with these inventions?
Thanks for listening to the show. If what you heard was helpful, hit the subscribe button and notification bell, leave us a comment, and check out these other episodes.